Hey everybody, how are you guys doing? I'm Eric Gerlach, and this is another talk on Greek philosophy and the Stoics, the final philosophy we will cover with Greek philosophies this semester in Greek philosophy. Who'da thunk it? So Stoicism was founded by Zeno of Citium, not Citrium, not the citrus bowl, and this is not the same Zeno as the first. There is Zeno Zeno, Parmenides' student and follower with the tortoise and the hare, and this is the central main forerunning Stoic. A Phoenician, which is today, I believe, present-day Lebanon in the Mediterranean, which I already spoke of. Thales, the first of the Greek philosophers we covered, and the last of the, not the last Stoic actually, and the last major philosopher we will cover. There will be Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius. But the first of the Milesians and the first of the Stoics, the first and the last groups we will cover in the class are Phoenicians, oddly enough. Zeno of Citium, and when I say Zeno from now on, I don't mean the old Zeno, was a Phoenician who lived sometime around 334 to 226 BCE. He was living in the capital of Cyprus, which today Larnaca, on the south coast of the island. While I will continue to refer to him as simply Zeno, and Cyprus was very in Phoenician control and then not, I believe, in history. Again, different Zeno of the Eleatics. According to Diogenes Laertius, the biographer we've heard a lot from, Zeno the Stoic from Citium was a merchant who survived a shipwreck. Archilochos, if you remember the Greek archaic poet, says, I hope you die, you're getting a shipwreck, pal. You know, used to be my friend. He says that that Zeno was a merchant who survived a shipwreck and found himself in Athens. Phoenicia was at the west end of the Silk Road and traded many goods, including spices from India and silks from China, to the Greeks and the Egyptians. After wandering into a bookstore, presumably to catch his breath, allowing his clothes to dry, though it's amusing to think of him walking straight out of the sea and into the gates of Athens and into a bookshop with his sandals a-squeaking, and water comically shooting out of each side with each sloppy step. Zeno found works about Socrates in the book scroll store. This would be a text store and not a bookstore with Chinese-style bendy books in the middle. And he asked the shop owner where he could find such a teacher. The text store owner, remember the old text shoppy, pointed to the most famous cynic in Athens, Crates of Thebes, who happened to be passing by, and said, "Follow that man." Clearly the owner saw Diogenes and the cynics as the true heir of Socrates in teaching, not like Diogenes did, and not like Plato. If the owner had sided with Plato, he would have directed Zeno to Plato's academy, and he did not. Zeno practiced being a cynic under Crates, so the Stoics are sort of an offshoot of the cynics of Diogenes, flipping people off, and if you tick him off enough, peeing on you. And then he probably won't even dignify with you with telling you it's raining later, He'll expect you to figure that out and be wrong for yourself. Zeno practiced being a cynic under Crates, living simply in public without luxury. Once Crates had Zeno carry a pot of lentil soup. This is an awesome story. Around Athens all day, the Stoic and the pot of lentil soup, until Crates suddenly smashed the pot, covering a surprised Zeno in soup in the middle of a crowd, who probably laughed and jeered at him. When Zeno began to run away embarrassed, Crates called out after him, "Why are you running, little Phoenician? Nothing terrible has happened to you." Attempting to show the young boy that, and like Diogenes, being ridiculed by people, well, if you live like a bum in the marketplace and you don't care, everybody points and laughs, you're like, hey, jerks, doesn't matter. Did anybody cut your foot off? No. You're fine. So, hey, he's, you survived a shipwreck, and here's some lentil soup all over you. Who cares, So later Stoics saw themselves as the inheritors of the cynical tradition. So in fact, there are cynics following Diogenes who are bums in Greece and Rome, and the Stoics think that these are not the right kind of folks. Oddly enough, again, I am no Trekkie. Of course, the Stoics are very logical, Captain. As we're going to get to, they are very much Spock. And oddly enough, of course, you have in the whole Trekkie thing, it's like, and it turns out that the Vulcans are an offshoot of what, the Romulans or something? Around here we know about that. And basically the Romulans are some other different culture of the same people or something. I'm not a Trekkie. But basically it is weirdly here, it's sort of like two different philosophies that are both very different from each other, but technically they spring from the same family, kind of like the Romulans and the stoic Vulcans and all that from the early Trekkie stuff. Again, I'm not the Trekkie, can't get too into it. I love science fiction, loved it as a teenager. Never the Trekkie, though, entirely. But when I was more into Asimov and all that, and the iRobot before Will Smith and all that. But when Zeno began to run away, well, yes, Zeno is embarrassed by the pot of the soup. And again, remember, Diogenes liked to roll in sand, hot sand, and snow in order to toughen himself. So rolling in soup in front of others toughens up the self and the ego and the mind. So the responsibilities, notice also, which is subtle but there, he's having this boy lug a pot of soup everywhere, and the boy's probably like, why am I doing this stupid thing? Well, the reason the boy was lugging the pot of soup everywhere was not actually to eat the soup, although if he had been lugging something less valuable than soup, he might have been like, can I put this thing down, or started to think differently. But he's been lugging a pot of soup everywhere, and then he gets that cracked all over him, and it's like, okay, so the thing you were totally responsible for and have to make, it's like the master loaded you up, and then the master smashed it. This is very Zen, like it's the staff is the stick of compassion. And the master decided to whack the situation in the pot of soup all over the guy in order to flip the script and change the situation. It's very much like a Zen koan. We're going to get all into that for the Buddhist philosophy class in the next couple of lectures here. So, after studying, I have an image online here, which is the original Stoa. The Stoa was a large, long, raised platform. You can go today to Athens and see what remains sort of smashed up of it if they know the right place, and I don't entirely doubt it. It was a very long stage, kind of a porch stage for public, well, possibly executions and other things, but for a lot of public sorts of things in a kind of square of town. And so after studying cynicism as well as Platonism, Pythagoreanism, and other schools of thought, Zeno began teaching in the Athenian marketplace atop the Stoa Poikile. I always think of the Three Stooges. It's like, hey, Poikile, wub, 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 wub. You know, the raised painted porch. Poikile? I don't know. I'm not Hawaiian. A public stage painted with murals depicting the great battles involving the Athenians. It is from this porch that Stoicism gets its name, which is actually porch-ishness, which is not really at all that has to do with the philosophy, in the same way that the Academy and the Tree Grove has nothing really to do with Plato. The Lyceum's, the wolf god has nothing to do with Aristotle, though walking about in Peripatetics does. Zeno's lectures drew many followers, including rich patrons and kings. It also clearly drew slaves. Mentioned Epicurus clearly opened his garden to women and slaves. Epictetus is a slave and one of the major Stoics. It does seem that Stoicism was popular amongst slaves, people do say. Not clear how much amongst women, or why women would or would not be into Stoicism. I mean that sincerely, you make your own jokes yourself, but no, I don't see any reason why Stoicism, as opposed to any other philosophy, or Pythagoreanism, would be more or less open to women. So maybe it's the personalities involved, maybe it is many different things. I would actually have to, again, look more into it, and I do know much is not known. Zeno was offered Athenian citizenship because his teachings attracted rich patrons and kings and others, and probably a decent amount of women, and a decent amount of slaves as well. But he declined, fearing it would betray and anger his fellow Phoenicians. Zeno was known for being sullen and quiet, preferring the company of a few or burying himself in his studies to socializing in large groups. I do like these stories. According to Diogenes Laertius, the biographer of the philosophers, Zeno avoided crowds, would walk and talk with only 2 or 3 others at a time, and would sit at the end of benches such that he was not surrounded, couldn't be pinned in. If many people crowded around him asking for answers, he would begin charging them larger and larger sums until they left him alone, which is great work if you can keep getting it. Zeno was also known for speaking briefly and chastising others who spoke at length without getting to the point. After his follower Ariston had been talking for a good long while like me, Zeno said, "It would have been impossible for you to speak this way if your father had not been drunk when he made you." I will let the physics and the biology of the old world, sink in as it will, and yeah, not describe that any further, or what, Pythagoras might have thought about that, or the left side of the womb. When another young follower was speaking too long, Zeno said, "Your ears have run down into your throat," which is a really cool way, possibly slightly rephrased. It's a good saying. When yet another follower was making unfounded arguments, Zeno said, "This is why we have 2 ears and only 1 mouth," and also said, "It is better to trip with the feet than with the tongue." I like to mention here in Hinduism, they sometimes teach children that Ganesh, the elephant-headed god, has 2 big ears and a very tiny mouth, which of course means listen a lot and talk a little bit, which is, yeah, it's a lesson for children. You know what I mean? You can use all sorts of things in all sorts of ways like that. Like Plato and Aristotle, Zeno, I was thinking of a Confucius quote. I was going to say Confucius hears one of his disciples going off and yakking similarly, and he says, "Oh, obviously Zigong has so much time, to do on these things. I don't have that kind of time myself." And says other things. It's like, wow, I don't have time to waste on all that nonsense, do I? But says it kind of nice. And again, Confucius has some good one-liners exactly like that, like Zeno. Seems a little type A, a little uptight, a little bit like Zeno. Is like, okay, well, but has a great sense of humor, and so has a wit like Zeno, Confucius of China. I do not yet have so many talks about that online, but I will soon. Like Plato and Aristotle, Zeno and later Stoics divided philosophy into 3 branches: physics, logic, and ethics. According to Zeno and Stoic conceptions of physics, the cosmos is a living, rational God. This is, again, teleology. Bananas and roots and people and goats have purposes. There's larger ideas and ideas as angels and spirits above us, and we participate in ideas as ideas of the cosmos. That is all very much ancient physics we've been covering again and again. The Stoics are into Heraclitus and also Plato and Pythagoras plenty, but different. So they know plenty of the Timaeus stuff we've already been going through. All things are equally a part of the supreme rational God being. A position decently known here, the Stoics, somewhat like the Taoists, are kind of pantheists, which is, as already mentioned, I believe, whenever I talk about ancient thought, and you find somebody who's more pantheistic like Spinoza in Amsterdam later, that is not the official Christian or Abrahamic position. That can get you condemned and or worse, killed or worse. That's technically saying this table right here in this computer monitor is equally God as far as the highest is pantheism, and panentheism or something similar is the position that God's sort of controlling everything, but is kind of above and then through crude matter, as if matter is sort of external to God, but God's so powerful that could just be any of it at any time. It's interesting when you think even about scientific objectivity, as I always like people to compare to their own beliefs rather than just say, oh, those aren't my beliefs. Scientific objectivity is sort of what's right in front of your face with your eyes, but it's also something more refined than that and kind of revered. So in a certain sense, scientific objectivity is just the sense you have in your head, as I remind my students every time I get. It's like, you should not just doubt expertise, but the experts have thought like you do. So if they end up saying something that doesn't totally make sense, you shouldn't simply doubt it, but you should investigate, and maybe they're wrong. Investigate, please. Well, of course, in this day and age in which we have lots of information, some good, some bad. But in a certain sense, it's like, well, is information and science just your mind right here? Well, no. And that, oddly enough, is kind of like pantheism. The Catholic Church and God kind of get to be more above, and it isn't just everybody and everything equally. So you do have popular movements and thinkers saying, no, God's just equally this hand and this table. Technically, that is a bit heretical in Christianity and Islam and the Abrahamic religions, and it can actually get you officially condemned here and then. Again, Spinoza had somebody try to run through his cloak after he left synagogue in Amsterdam, which was already a harsh lot, because Jews are not, are hated and a minority in Amsterdam. But then he wore that cloak with a knife cut all through it, be like, hey, I'm the pantheist that they couldn't get, knife God or not, that in your hand or not. That, yeah, basically it's like Spinoza was proud of how he was a pantheist, thought everything was equally God and mathematics, because he's a rationalist and believes this is very Newtonian cosmos. It's all equally God. To him, substance, physics, etc. And yeah, both the Jewish and Christian community might have wanted Spinoza killed in the late 1500s, I believe, which would have been a whole lot long after this. But the Stoics, again, are somewhat more pantheistic, And again, at the time in Greco-Roman stuff, which was also the time of Christianity, and Christians get a lot from Stoicism, and seem to, the Stoics are kind of more, no, there is a rational mind in the universe, but it is mathematics and physics right in front of your face. As the table, as your hand, as the mind throughout all. It's a bit Anaxagoras as well, although he, again, like Plato, kind of puts the mind above and beyond the cow that it drags, which is us. And then we have other stuff. The Stoics were interpreted Heraclitus as saying that the cosmos is not merely a fire, but a single mind that perceives itself entirely as everything in all of its motions. We are the thoughts of the bigger mind, basically. When you have thoughts, you are a thought, and then you can have thoughts. So meta bro. Again, Aristotle is the so meta bro. Christianity was influenced by Stoicism and by Heraclitus via Stoicism, but the Orthodox Catholic position, as well as the position of many American Protestants today, is again, God is not identical with the world. Forgive me again for talking about everything you're not supposed to at the dinner table, but again, I do not push any position on you. As I reiterate, I am merely mentioning all the positions, and I do believe in being the guy who can tell you all about the philosophical and religious positions and the history of human thought. So if you don't want to listen to me go on historically about monotheism ever, too dang bad. And again, everybody doesn't like somebody else's religion. The non-religious thus don't like any religion. Religious people don't like anything else a lot of the time. So again, unfortunately, this is unpleasant for everyone except for me. I love this kind of stuff, I kid again because I think everybody should learn more history of thought. It's not about agreeing or disagreeing with it, is of course what I am saying. And I do believe in that. I do. Especially, there is recently I have been seeing more and more things. It's like religious prejudice does run very deep. That means theism divided and atheism, theism divided. All of that. So be careful you don't dehumanize anybody in their history too much. Hopefully, this class has shown you a lot of intellectual history. Not just that the Greeks think, but that Muslims, Christians, Greeks, Indians, all sorts of people think, which you hopefully can get by watching other lectures of mine on other subjects, but not this. But yes, back to the Stoics and pantheistic God, that for Zeno and the Stoics, there is no difference between the one and the demiurge so much. And again, you kind of have this Parmenidean, it's all one, don't you? It all, again, there are various positions and they do overlap and then people debate, but then also kind of have these positions anyway. Kind of have their cake and eat it too, oddly enough. So recently, some right-wing evangelicals, and again, I'm not saying don't be that, but I have noticed it's like I'm from lefty land out here, and I have actually been calling environmentalism, and here again, be that or not, or evangelical as much or as little as you like, is that it is a new kind of pantheism. That when hippies go out there, apparently, they had a decent environmentalists being a decent target of the FBI, etc. Not so much white-collar crime, though. It's odd. The trees might appreciate it, not sure. A dangerous heretical force of the left is portrayed in the DVD Resisting the Green Dragon, which now is probably old, kind of stuff, given all sorts of new internet things. But again, when you ever hear anybody say New Agers, Wiccans, or Unitarians are all kind of trying to be pantheistic, oddly enough, again, that fits with Stoicism and Spinoza and a whole lot of other people. Weirdly enough. In the Resisting the Green Dragon, they actually then argue, of course, they aren't saying, and by the way, that's their God. They are saying, actually, that is a deceitful lie of Satan, who is trying to fool you. I realize now I should have done a lot more jokes about how the devil's trying to fool you and then rule you, but Cthulhu don't care. He's like the honey badger. Gigantic cosmic honey badger does not care. So again, I was working in the Cthulhu angle last time. The Stoics do believe that the cosmos is much more of a monotheistic thing and that it really has a plan for you that probably is very rational and mathematical and Pythagorean. Epicurus is like, there's giant Cthulhus out there. One of them's mistaken for Zeus. I suggest we try to make each other happy because that's really the tuning fork of our lives. We're ants. The Stoics, they think we're ants. We should accept that we're ants very much within the cosmos. But the cosmos is rational and does share our mind with us, much more so than Cthulhu, who does not care, gives 0 foxes. Yes? So many bears. So, lie, but we grin and bear it. Like Heraclitus, the Stoics believe the soul is made of fire and the elements undergo cycles of transformation and destruction, each dying to give birth to the next. The reason that we see and perceive is that our mind soul is akin to the pure primordial fire itself, making us an inferior and limited copy. Unlike Heraclitus, the Stoics believe that the cosmic fire is actually ether, which again shows you they are coming along in a later stage here with these other folks, Timaeus and other Pythagoreans, Platonists. The fire air, Aristotle says, makes up the heavenly bodies, which then condenses into lower fire, which further condenses to make additional 3 elements. Oddly like plasma, but also not at all. Unlike the Pythagoreans and the Pyrrhonists and the Epicureans, unlike the Pyrrhonists and Epicureans, who point to the suffering of the world as the problem of evil, Zeno and the Stoics believe the cosmos is rational and good, preserving what is good and dissolving what is bad. The Pythagorean why. They are quite Pythagorean, as well as they like Heraclitus, which is another thing to throw in here. That's confusing. While there is some room for free will and choice, Stoics placed value in acceptance of fate. That is very much, some would say Taoistic, although some wonder how much the Taoists do very much say fate, but it's less a particular destination that's going to change into that as much as things do not change, and they always remain the same. For the Stoics, the cosmos has a plan for you. Things don't always stay the same, and you may as well accept your better fate and get there better that way. Although, again, how deterministic is this entirely? How much choice do you really have? The cosmos works things out in the long run, even if they are difficult in a given situation. And so the wise individual must bear their fate without discomfort or fear, just as the cynics, such as Crates, practice by exposing themselves to the elements, and occasionally soup. In one story told by Diogenes Laertius, biographer to the philosophers, Zeno discovered someone attempting to steal from him. And as he beat him, the thief, who seems familiar with Stoicism, protested, "I was destined to steal." To which Zeno replied, "Yes, and to be beaten." Whether or not that means there's any free will, that doesn't actually answer the free will, is there any free will circling back through here question. I have seen, and I like to mention here, I saw somebody, I do stick up for relativism, subjectivism, postmodernism, and say, there's plenty of human to that, and that's good learning. Them's good eating. And I have seen a lot of memes making fun of skepticism, relativism, and postmodernism over the years because some truth is, of course, no truth at all to the dogmatist. Again, you will find that true in life. If you say truth is some and some, to the person who thinks that truth is all or none, you just said none at all. That is a very real thing. So try not to pull that on others so much and show a little degree of patience. But I remember seeing an image where it shows kind of a crying white guy who seems like he's like on stuff and things, and he's somewhere in a not great place in this wonderful land of ours, and the cops are putting him into the back of the cop car, and he is crying away. Unfortunately, I will not find the image or shame this man further, as he already is making was years ago making the rounds. But it says in meme type, with the memes and the meme-ish type, it says there, it's like, no, wait, you don't understand. Postmodernism says truth is relative, therefore I get to go free or something. It's like, haha, relativism's stupid. And it's like, well, technically, not only if you get arrested and you have enough cash and they find that out, you go free, and things like that. Life is fair and unfair plenty. But at the same time, if you hear, this reminds me always of this. It's like, I was destined to steal. It was my fate. You have to let me go. It's like, and to be beaten and to be caught then. You know what I mean? If you say, postmodernism means everything's relative, then why can't the cops have the freedom to go interpret their paycheck and then the bank interprets it and decides to give them most of their money other than the fees? It's an interpretive world. So if it's like, no, I get to freely interpret my world. That's what subjectivity tells me in philosophy. But if everybody is doing that, Nietzsche, very similarly, the great mustachioed one, is known for saying, no, he famously and controversially says God is dead. He is punning off Jesus Christ, who died and then is risen, because God dies and then is risen, and says now, basically, we don't know what to do. And he means that there was modernity and now it's fallen into like everything's somewhat adrift. And if you say, well, that's just stupid because it isn't just whatever. It's like, well, but if someone's destined to steal, someone else may be destined to catch them. And alternatively, if it's your free will to steal and interpret reality such that you get to steal, hey, I get to be an illegalist according to the French and be Bonnie and Clyde, and that's totally fine. Yes. But the thing is, you forfeited your rights right there to not allow the cops to might make right and be like, but we like making a paycheck and now we're taking you down and that's our interpretation of reality and there's a few more of us than you and we have a couple more guns. So them's Thruss and Marcus for you, you know? Both sides of the relativism, of course. For Zeno and the Stoics, studying logic is important not only for investigating and arguing, but for avoiding deception, to prevent being persuaded by the faulty arguments of others. Unlike Pyrrhonists, skeptics, Zeno believed that some matters are incomprehensible. This is actually like Kant and Russell, two major names in German and then British American analytic thought. That Kant and Russell say, okay, they're both of them like Zeno here. They believe in objective truth. So if you believe in objective truth and you believe that everything isn't subjective, everything isn't some things are all or none. One of the first questions that a thinker like that would have, and here I am not taking sides, but one of the first questions you would have is, which things are all or none, right? And then you would say, okay, so how do we divide? And what you would have is a very Pythagorean why, and you see this in Zeno the Stoic, and you see this in Kant and German idealism and rationalism, which is very much early modern European philosophy. And then you also see this in Russell, who's very much the start of American and Anglican analytic philosophy. We need to divide the issues we can entirely know from the issues we're never going to know. Which I have to say, as a skeptic, of course, I'm more skeptical. Well, there's shades of gray, right? And there's lots of, in fact, Wittgenstein would suggest any situation may have its own shades of gray by the situation. Maybe you're having a situation of hearing something. Maybe you're having a situation more of seeing something in tennis alone. Well, your shades of gray would vary there, would be later Wittgenstein. But I would say that's a bit better. But one of the questions before that, though, you would have is if you're trying to divide the objective from the subjective, you would find a lot of times people would start off with the question, okay, what can we never know at all, like everybody's favorite flavor of ice cream? We're just going to leave that entirely off the board. And as somebody focused on objective thinking and thought, we're going to eliminate everything and pare it down. We're going to whittle down to the pure data, as Russell says. Can we do that? That's a great question we will be asking all throughout next semester. By the way, we're wrapping up very much Philosophy 20A. Philosophy 20B is modern European philosophy after ancient Greek philosophy. So the next following course, often in the series of undergraduate requirements in America and elsewhere, are 20A Greek philosophy paired with 20B modern European, starting with Descartes, and I go clean on past Kant through to postmodernism. So, and Hegel. Some people, a lot of Americans don't like Hegel and everything after, want you to stop at Kant in the late 1700s because that's modern philosophy. We'll talk all about that later. But regardless of all of that, if you are a person who says there is objective truth, one of the questions you will often find yourself asking with the Stoics is, what can be totally eliminated and taken off the table as subjective, and what's left on the table as the objective black and white? That's a good question. I suspect those methods, but I'm going to tell you we all do all of these different methods, and what does that mean to you and I, and how do we do it, of course? It would be very silly to think I'm just a some and some thinker. I don't think black and white at all. It's like, well, I would watch you and think otherwise, because we all are back and forth. And anybody who gets kicked in the shins is rather black and white, all or none about plenty. So, what do you eliminate, and what do you think is the important thing, is something that one says when you are looking for the objective truth. So, Zeno says, some matters are incomprehensible, others are comprehensible, and it is the goal of philosophy to refrain from pursuing the incomprehensible and pursue and grasp the comprehensible. It's a bit similar to, my mother had a Central American plaque from the 80s of the Prayer of St. Francis of Assisi, patron saint of San Francisco. And it says, which the prayer says, grant me the strength to change what I can, the patience to endure what I cannot, and the wisdom to know the difference. Now that could be read more dogmatically, more black and white, or more skeptically, more shades of gray. So that doesn't have to be a dividing why entirely, exclusively. But that itself actually traces it out. What can I do? What can't I do? And how do I decide and make the decision and split the two apart? Although perhaps with Anaxagoras, no two things are split entirely with an axe. A Pyrrhonian skeptic, who certainly does not believe any two things are split entirely with an axe, would deny the difference between the incomprehensible and the comprehensible as exclusive, and argue that things are both incomprehensible and comprehensible altogether, and yet all things should be pursued and investigated. I happen to like the Jains of India. They would specifically say that, and the Buddhists follow them, and the Zen follow them. And I do like, recently, had a Mazu thing. If you think, yeah, okay, what's comprehensible right here? You know, what's the meaning of this moment? How objective is right here and now? And you're like, well, there's kind of this and kind of that. Yeah, you know, it's again, you can be like, okay, what are the absolute facts you're staring at? Like right here. How can you divide that from the shades of gray? And that's something people probably have done around the campfire for, well, perhaps over 100,000 years, long before literacy and mathematics at all, with very much the same brains. It's very, very possible. Because again, I'm having this discussion with you without, well, it's not really a discussion, but without much math in the ever-loving slightest. How logical is this talk, you can ask? How much sense am I making versus not making sense? And can you find the dividing line between the sense I'm making and the sense I'm leaving open such that it doesn't entirely make focused sense? That would be denying the sharp line and the black and white between the incomprehensible and the comprehensible. The Jains say all things can and cannot be described in human words. Zeno taught his stages of argument via logic by using his hand as a metaphor, as people probably did around the fire for 100,000 years now, with the same brains. Well over even, many say. Stretching out his hand, palm open as if to receive, he would say, perception is like this, open. Closing his fingers slightly, he would say, assent, agreement, is like this. Zeno considered assent or agreement to be a free act. There's a little bit of free will in there, possibly not hardcore determinism. Again, that's debatable. Such that we can choose whether or not to agree or assent. That's like opinion. That's not fact and knowledge. That's just agreeing with a flavor of ice cream or somebody's, yeah, no, I think your opinions about that sports team is decently well-founded enough. That's assent that's free. Notice the Stoic does not think knowledge is free interpretation. So agreement is free. But are you free to agree with whatever fact? No, you have to agree with what's right if you're totally knowing it. I mean, you don't have to. You'd be wrong. But you're not really free to agree with the truth. That is more the fatalism of the Stoic. Perception is like this, and perception is like this, totally open. Assent is like this, somewhat open, but still free. Closing his hand into a fist, there's the closure. Complete, but not the final stage. Zeno would say comprehension, understanding, and knowledge. Well, let's say understanding is like this. And then clasping his fist in the other hand, he would say knowledge is like this. So understanding and then even knowledge. Now notice actually that is kind of like here's you, here's the church, here's the steeple, here's you, here's the world or something like that. But there's something where there's you and then the other thing complementing it from outside. Then there's knowledge and not just understanding, but knowledge, which sort of suggests you're enveloped by something else, or whatever this image is meant to convey. It's sort of, notice, it's kind of like stages of you and then fitting in completely to the cosmos such that click. And that's exactly why, while you're free to wander around in here, this is really you, somewhat Buddhistic and Jain-like and Indian, is you fitting into the cosmos. That's really the fitting into the fate right there. There isn't a lot of room for freedom, but there is weirdly... You could always think of it as Taoist freedom. Once you're in the way, no, you're free and you're doing everything freely. It's just you're just so solidly in the way. Why are you deviating from the course of nature itself? You wouldn't want to. You are it. That would be the way of retaining the freedom in it. So, Zeno believed that only the truly wise attain knowledge, similar to Plato's few who make it out of the cave in his Republic. Notice that's 4 stages actually, not 3 of the fist. Heraclitus, Sextus, and other skeptical thinkers would deny the difference between opinion and knowledge and might suggest to Zeno that he need never completely enclose his fist to grasp things. There is a Buddhist Zen koan, which we will cover soon. I think it may be in the Gateless Gate. It may be in Zen Stories, which is actually a much later collection. Is possibly even almost 1,000 years later. Is that there is, it's a story that actually finds its way into Zen in China, but you can find the story in other schools. I believe Confucians also tell a version of the story, and they're the ones who are cool in that. But a guy hears about a man. It's also alternatively told the wife of a rich guy who is very stingy and won't spend any money and won't help people with money. And people are having problems in the community with the rich guy and or wife not sort of paying their fair share, being like, oh, we'll pay for that. Oh, no, we're not going to pay for that. I'm not paying for this. So the Zen monk master and or Confucian goes to them and says, if my hand were always like this, what would it be? And we'll go with the rich guy, says, well, it would be deformed. And then he closes his hand. He says, if my hand was always like this, what would it be? And the guy's like, well, it would be deformed. He's like, yup, takes off. Because, of course, now notice, it's like knowledge is like this. Well, the skeptic would be like, so I'm like this, I'm like this, I'm like this all day. Well, of course, the Stoics want you to more resolute down and fit, and fate. So it's not so open forking the Y and branching, because it is balancing you out and getting you into the zone, as it were. So it's not too claustrophobic, of course, if you're in the way of all things, but again, it does not present itself as so much freedom as much as silence. Notice Zeno does not like talking to so many people, and he likes sitting alone sort of in himself, it would seem, at the end of a bench. Public or not. So like Socrates, Stoics believe that all evil is caused by ignorance, and reason is in accord with logos of the cosmos. That's Heraclitus to the Plato. When our logic does not match the logos, that is ignorance and evil. It's a bit Socrates too. We might never see whenever we are evil, because evil is always a form of ignorance. We think we're fine because we are ignorant. A simple and reasonable life in which one accepts one's place in fate without excessive desire brings tranquility and happiness. We still use the word stoic, of course, to mean sullen and resolute in a way. Not really happy. In fact, more sullen, again, steady, unmoved. To mean straight-faced, showing little emotion, even in difficulty as well. Especially in difficulty, as Epictetus, so epic, will show us, unfortunately, in a sec. So Diogenes, the original cynic, again, used to walk in snow, roll in sand. Zeno taught that desires, fear, and pain come about when we are not in accord with the way of things. Little Tao. Virtue flows naturally from the cosmos, vice from deviating. Paradoxically, freedom is obtained by submitting to fate. Freedom arising from accepting what must be. In the Hagakure, which is in the shadow of leaves, of Yamamoto Tsunetomo, one of the central sources of Japanese samurai culture. There's a lot of controversial things to say about that in Japanese history. I will leave that to a talk next time, next semester on Asian philosophy, specifically Japanese Zen and samurai culture. So, he says that there is something to be learned in a rainstorm that applies to all of everything in life. That is a wonderful Stoic lesson, although this is a much later samurai in Japan. If a person doesn't want to get wet, they hurry and try to walk under shelter, but get soaked anyway. The person who knows and accepts that they are going to get soaked, they have already destroyed their iPhone, yes? They are going to get soaked and get just as wet. Their phone will be just as broken. They walk calmly, without fear or concern. Accepting the inevitability of mistakes, pain and betrayal, frees the mind to see the immediate. In the Dhammapada, this Zen text probably is thinking of the original, one of the original most faithful texts of the original Buddha, which says, like the war elephant, I will endure the slings and arrows of battle as I trudge forward. And then links that to other things, which is like the rainstorm, like arrows. It's like, if I'm going to get killed, if I'm going to get just utterly pelted with arrows and live through it, well, then I'm going to take this slowly and well, and I'm going to be calm, and I'm going to be good. That is logical, Captain. With Spock with no emotions, he's like, Spock, I have desires for green women. He's like, that is not logical, Captain. And that's so Captain Kirk can bounce off the walls, as the captain with the Green Lady people. And Spock can be like, well, that certainly, is not the most logical I've ever seen, but, that's, you can have the straight guy, the straight guy routine and all of that, cosmically. There's another great Zen joke here I will just throw in because there's a moment here. There is a Zen master I've read in later, apparently, well, it could be a somewhat medieval Chinese story, but in like around the year 1000 or so. I don't know when exactly this happened or to whom, but it's a Zen story tucked in one of the Zen collections I have. It says a monk is asking his students, 2 people walked in the rain, one got wet. Why? And after so many answers, it's like an umbrella, walked under the awning, is one of them walked at night, one of the other one walked when there wasn't rain, like all these answers and everything, and all the monks are thinking and being like, sir, I know, pick me. It's like, nope. Says, why did one get wet? Because both got wet. Think about how well that works in English or any language. And the mind, if we have anything like human logic and thought, it predates literacy, and that would be what Zen and this philosophy stuff is screwing with as it moves from the oral to the more textual traditions. 2 walked in the rain, one got wet. Why? Because both got wet. So one got wet, and the other got wet. So both got wet. Big and Science says, close one of your eyes. Are you seeing half dark or just one of your eyes? You're just seeing one of your eyes. And again, with philosophy and logic, you can get people to move back and forth. I just had to throw that in there because, again, it is like the rainstorm enduring my terrible anecdotal evidence. So unlike Epicurus, Zeno argued that pleasure is dangerous, a bit like a rainstorm. A negative force, again, remember Heraclitus thinks pleasure makes the soul soggy and not so dry. The Stoics would appreciate that. You dry out your mind fire. You don't go around drinking and make your mind fire soggy and wet. That screws up your mind fire. Pleasure is a negative force that impedes the achievement of tranquility. Epicurus would reply, it is desire leads us to that it is desire that leads us to pursue destructiveness in terms of short-term pleasure, but pleasure when properly oriented, of course, Epicurus would say, is not destructive. Zeno argued that we should replace desire with will, fear with caution, and pleasure with joy. In Indian thought, there is a similar distinction between pleasure one gets in particular things and joy, it's often translated as joy, that one gets from simply being itself. If you are happy and you know it and you don't even have to clap your hands, that is joy. You are joyful in life. If you are happy about something, you're happy about something. And again, here we can use words interchangeably. Oftentimes, there is ways that joy becomes the Indian translation. Unfortunately, I will be fully controversial, as I like to say. It is also true for anybody who digs deep enough, and I have Nazi propaganda and German propaganda. Not only did they jack a bit of the swastika and had a bunch of philosophers and thinkers who knew well enough how to use slogans and words and teachings of ancient and modern times. The Nazis, unfortunately, also used to say strength through joy, which means, unfortunately, I have to say, no, if you're a really good Nazi, you're not just happy about this or that or the Nazis winning or losing. You're just happy being a Nazi in general. Hooray! Let's hope, of course, we actually get joy from being one and the same with all animals and people like the Upanishads, and not just from taking Nazi nature hikes, with the Hitler Juden, with the Hitler Boy Scouts. But yeah, then again, joy even here. Let's ruin all of this. Yes, it's like, well, joy, pure happiness in and of itself. Well, not only is it debatable whether or not you can be happy in and of itself, in anywhere near Lake Wobegon, but yeah. It's actually one, you could even wonder again to screw everything up. Are any of these lessons something that can simply be used for good or bad? Well, let's pay attention, and all of that. I want to mention that because, of course, as soon as I remember the Nazis, I don't want to get out of here being like, oh, joy's always fun. You know what I mean? It's like, oh, happiness itself. What happens if you're told to feel happiness itself for a pretty terrible, monstrous regime? In particular, is that joy or not? Yeesh. So Epicurus would agree with all this, as would Aristotle, who would, not the Nazis anyway, who would see the negative as an excess or lack and the positive as moderation. So like Epicurus, Zeno placed value on friendship, even if he was likely uncomfortable having many friends in the same room with him. When asked what a friend is, Zeno replied, "Another I." There's a Mayan wisdom proverb in the work of Leon Portilla which says, "You are my other self." Just as we should be one with the cosmos, not deviating from its path with our desire, we should identify with other individuals, such that our desires do not deviate from the common good. Additionally, Stoics preach egalitarianism, that we are all equal. Like Epicureanism, Stoicism was open to slaves. Again, we know it was more open to slaves, and we know Epicurus was open to slaves and women. So why don't we know the Stoics were open to women? It's a weird thing. I'm not sure. They were more vocal about being open to slaves. But what does that mean? While Zeno did not say that the institution of slavery should be abolished, he taught that the wise consider slaves to be equal to themselves, even if each has a different lot in life to accept with Stoic resolution. This is where Stoicism is not liberation theology. Certainly, it's more pantheism, solar pantheism. But later Stoics argued it is proper to free slaves upon one's death. Like Diogenes, Stoics also believed in cosmopolitanism, that all people of the world are equals. Diogenes Laertius claims that Zeno died by holding his breath, which he also says about Diogenes the Cynic, which I'm pretty sure, and I think specialists do, that is physically impossible. But let's not get into it because I can't and don't want to. As with many other ancient Greek philosophers, only fragments of Zeno's Stoicism come down to us through quotations of other authors, particularly those of the Stoics Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius. However, before considering them, the only period from which we have the Stoic texts that survive, we will consider for a moment the early Stoic systematizer Chrysippus, who his name does indeed sound like Kissy-puss. So Chrysippus, and Merry Chrysippus, to all of you and yours, is happy, Stoic solar days, lived sometime from 279 to 206 BCE, was the third master of the Stoic school after Zeno and Cleanthes, but he's known as the second patriarch because he systematized Zeno. He told Cleanthes, "Give me the principles and I'll find the proofs myself." He was from Ionia, moved to Athens as a young man, where he found Cleanthes and the Stoics, and studied with them. He wrote hundreds of works, all of which are lost, only fragments and quotes surviving in the work of others. Now, Chrysippus developed the physics and ethics of Stoicism, but he is most famous for his contributions to logic, which is sad a bit, because the Stoics learned much logic from Aristotle, but they found his syllogisms insufficient for dealing with all sorts of things. While Aristotle's syllogisms do use if and then, anybody who is a student of logic, and I am going to get much more into logic in the next couple of months, because I got a lot of videos to do about that, Lewis Carroll and a bunch of stuff. I've been doing a lot with Lewis Carroll, as I keep mentioning. Lewis Carroll comes along at a time where he was still teaching Aristotle's syllogisms, and he was reading the work of De Morgan and Boole, who were just beginning to use things like and or as logical connectives. But they were somewhat inspired by Chrysippus, because it turns out the Stoics, who are a major school of thought in Greece and Rome, they had logical formations like and or, which is very much like primitive Wittgenstein's early Wittgenstein's truth tables, which is the basis of a lot of formal logic you would teach in a formal logic class, which is based on and or being computer-like functions. Anybody who is a student of computer logic should know that and or function in functionalistic mathematical ways according to formal and or computer logic. Well, Chrysippus was dealing with ifs and thens like Aristotle, but also ands and ors and how they functioned. I am very into that, and I will save all of my thinking on early versus later Wittgenstein on whether or not and or have strict functions. I will save all of that ranting for another time. Let me just say, Wittgenstein says and or are elastic. It's electric, also elastic, which means they stretch, whether or not you're at a salad bar. Pay attention to how you use them, and you'll find and or can sometimes be interchangeable because they stretch so much. You can have eggs or steak or bacon. You can have eggs and steak and bacon. Take your pick. If you have an open choice, you can use and or interchangeably, which means we don't actually use them strictly in language, and I'll leave why that is for my Wittgensteinian rantings some other time, because that is not now. All I will say is, oddly enough, people somewhat threw out Aristotle's logic, or at least complemented it with a bunch of other stuff, once they got, 2,000 years later, back into things like Chrysippus was doing long after Chrysippus had been doing them and had been forgotten, and his hundreds of works all abandoned and basically destroyed. Sad, isn't it? So it's with Wittgenstein's truth tables that actually then the modern folks gave or anything like formal definitions and structures, which I actually think are partly mistaken, but I will save that for some other time. Chrysippus also used conjunctions, that would be things like and, to make probabilistic statements, such as more likely than and less likely than. He also studied paradoxes like those of the other Zeno, not the Stoic, the Eleatic, and logical fallacies. Chrysippus was, in Greece and Rome, as famous as Aristotle at logic, but because the Neoplatonists took up the logic of Aristotle and Plato's not so much the explicit logician, Plato's student, into the Logos though, Plato's not Stoic logic, it was Aristotle's logic that became famous in the Islamic and then the Christian world. And Chrysippus' genius then was only later recognized. So, that said, this is 50 minutes on that. That is good. We are going to do later Stoicism, and like later Roman Stoicism with Epictetus, so epic bro, and Marcus Aurelius, and I will do a shorter video on the two of them and later Roman Stoicism, and stop here right now, which is a good stopping place. So much happiness, again, accept things stoically and tranquilly. And I will be giving another video at least for this class, and then perhaps we'll have a sum up video or what have you, but I will then be concluding this part of the series on Greek philosophy. So again, much happiness, although more so stoic tranquility if you are logical captain, and I will see you and Tennille if I ever see you.